In the late afternoon of November 30th, 1864, in the rolling fields outside Franklin, Tennessee, men braced for a storm of gunfire. Patrick Ronayne Cleburne surveyed the formidable Union defenses and knew what awaited his men. Earlier that day, he and other officers had warned their commanding general, John Bell Hood, that a frontal assault here would be a terrible and useless waste of life. But Hood, desperate for victory, ordered the attack anyway. Cleburne and the others accepted their fate with grim resolve. As Cleburne mounted his horse to form up his troops, he declared, "General, I will take those works or fall in the attempt." Moments before the charge on a rise called Breezy Hill, Cleburne gathered his brigade commanders for final instructions. Brigadier General Daniel Govan noted that Cleburne looked greatly depressed, knowing the odds were against them. Govan saluted and murmured, "Well, General, few of us will ever return to Arkansas to tell the story of this battle." And Cleburne's reply to him became the stuff of legend. He said, quote, "Well, Govan, if we are to die, let us die like men." And with those words, the Irish-born general led his division forward into the fading daylight. In the slaughter that followed, later remembered as the Valley of Death, Cleburne would fulfill his own prophecy. This is the story of Patrick Cleburne, how a humble immigrant rose to become one of the Confederacy's most respected generals, and why his men nicknamed him the Stonewall of the West, and how his bold ideas and battlefield heroics made him a legend among Civil War history buffs. So the question is, how did an Irish pharmacist end up charging into history on that fateful evening in Tennessee? Let's rewind the clock and begin where Cleburne's journey started, not in Dixie, but in County Cork, Ireland. Picture a young Patrick Cleburne in rural Ireland long before he donned Confederate gray. He was born on March 16, 1828, the day before St. Patrick's Day in County Cork. His father, Joseph Cleburne, was a respected country doctor, and his mother, Mary Ann Ronan, came from a middle-class Protestant family. Now, tragically, Patrick's mother died when he was just an infant, and his father remarried, adding half-siblings to the family. By his mid-teens, Patrick had endured more loss. His father died of typhus in 1843, leaving the family in precarious straits. At 15, Patrick was expected to follow his father into medicine, but a setback altered that course. He failed the entrance exam to a Dublin medical college, an embarrassment that he felt too deeply to return home. Rather than face his family's disappointment, the 18-year-old Cleburne made a drastic choice. He enlisted in the British Army. In 1846, he joined the 41st Regiment of Foot, hoping for adventure abroad. Instead, he found himself posted at barracks across now famine-stricken Ireland during the Great Hunger of the late 1840s. For 3 years, Corporal Cleburne performed thankless duties like keeping order in a homeland racked by starvation and unrest, even witnessing the failed Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. By 1849, with Ireland's woes deepening and his family farm struggling to pay rent, Patrick set his sights on a new world. He purchased his discharge from the British Army and, along with 2 brothers and a sister, boarded a ship for America. They landed in New Orleans on Christmas Day, 1849, hoping for a fresh start. After a brief stint in the big city, the Cleburne siblings traveled up the Mississippi River, searching for opportunities. Patrick found it in the frontier town of Helena, Arkansas, arriving in the spring of 1850. The 21-year-old Irishman was starting from scratch in a strange land, but he wasted no time. With a knack for chemistry and a healer's heart inherited from his father, Patrick took a job as a pharmacist's assistant at Nash and Grant's drugstore in Helena. Working among the jars and tinctures, Patrick Cleburne learned the trade and earned enough to settle permanently. By 1855, he had obtained American citizenship and had fully embraced his new home. Cleburne didn't remain a pharmacist forever. Ambitious and eager to advance, he spent his nights studying law. As soon as he was eligible after 5 years' residency, he passed the Arkansas bar in 1856 and became a lawyer. He partnered with a fiery young attorney named Thomas Hinman, who would later also become a Confederate general. Life in Helena offered Cleburne a chance to reinvent himself. This once shy Irish immigrant joined local debate clubs, attended balls, even helped nurse the sick during a yellow fever epidemic, one of the few volunteers who was brave enough to do so. These acts of community service endeared him to his new neighbors. Politically, Cleburne found his values aligning with many of his fellow Southerners, albeit with an interesting twist. He became a Democrat and vehemently opposed the nativist Know-Nothing Party. Unsurprising for an immigrant who had faced anti-Irish prejudice. In fact, his law partner Hinman ran for Congress against a Know-Nothing candidate, a contest that turned violent when their rival ambushed them on a Helena street. Cleburne was wounded in the fracas, shot in the back, but he survived. Despite this rough introduction to American politics, Cleburne's commitment to his adopted region only deepened. He never owned enslaved people and privately voiced misgivings about the institution of slavery, but he believed strongly in the idea of states' rights and the South's right to determine that for themselves. This outlook, he later explained, was partially shaped by seeing the Irish struggle for independence from the British, something that he saw as a personal parallel that made him sympathetic to Southern grievances. By the late 1850s, Patrick Cleburne was a respected lawyer and a local militia captain, thoroughly woven into the fabric of Arkansas life. But the winds of war were about to upend everything. When Arkansas seceded from the Union on May 6, 1861, Patrick Cleburne cast his lot with his adopted state. He'd already joined a volunteer militia company called the Yell Rifles that January, drilling locals in soldiering skills he had learned in the British Army. The Yell Rifles, named for Arkansas Governor Archibald Yell, soon proved their mettle. In February 1861, Cleburne led them to the state capital, Little Rock, as secession loomed. There they helped seize the federal arsenal without firing a shot, after Union troops had wisely evacuated. This bloodless victory emboldened Arkansas's secessionists. By that summer, the Yell Rifles were mustered into Confederate service as Company F of the 1st Arkansas Infantry, and their charismatic Irish captain was elected colonel of the regiment. Cleburne, the immigrant, pharmacist, attorney, turned officer, quickly proved to be a natural leader of men. Standing about 5'9", with piercing blue eyes and a thick Irish brogue, he cut an unusual figure in the Confederate ranks, but his men came to revere his coolness under fire and his tactical abilities. Early in the war, he was sent east of the Mississippi as part of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. By the fall of 1861, just months into his service, Cleburne was entrusted with command of a brigade in General William Hardee's division. His rapid promotion was a sign of confidence in this novice officer's talents. It would soon be justified on the battlefield. Cleburne saw his first major action at the Battle of Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee on April 6th and 7th of 1862. This was a brutal initiation. Shiloh's two-day carnage shocked the nation with over 23,000 casualties. On the battle's first morning, Cleburne's brigade was in the forefront of the Confederate surprise attack on Union camps. Amid the roar of cannon and musketry along the Tennessee River, Cleburne led his Arkansas and Tennessee men against stubborn Union defenses. It was chaos for the untested colonel. Going toe-to-toe against a Union division near Shiloh Church under William Tecumseh Sherman, Cleburne led his men admirably. But ultimately, the Union Army, reinforced overnight, drove the exhausted Confederates back. Shiloh was technically a draw, but Cleburne had acquitted himself well in his baptism of fire. More importantly, he had caught the attention of his superiors. In March of 1862, even before Shiloh, Cleburne's evident potential earned him promotion to brigadier general, commanding that brigade of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee regiments. After Shiloh, he continued to rise within the Army of Tennessee as it maneuvered through the Western Theater. That summer, General Braxton Bragg launched his ambitious Kentucky campaign, aiming to bring Kentucky into the Confederacy. Cleburne and his brigade marched northward into Kentucky's bluegrass, where he would fight one of his most brilliant and personally costly actions. On August 30th, 1862, Cleburne distinguished himself at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, a fight often overshadowed by bigger battles, but one in which he played a key role. Under Major General Edmund Kirby Smith, Cleburne's brigade encountered a Union force blocking the way to Lexington. He skillfully deployed his men and helped rout the Federals in a decisive Confederate victory. But the triumph came at a price. During the fighting, Cleburne was struck in the face by a shell fragment. The shrapnel ripped through his left cheek, knocking out several teeth and temporarily taking him out of the action. Bleeding and in great pain, he had to relinquish command. Cleburne's men, seeing their leader hit, feared the worst, but the tough Irishman survived, bearing a dramatic scar and dental wounds as a permanent memento of the Battle of Richmond. Within 6 weeks, he recovered and rejoined the army. His bravery at Richmond did not go unnoticed. The Confederate Congress officially thanked Cleburne for his valor there, an honor bestowed on few officers during the war. Now, barely had he returned to duty when Cleburne was in the thick of another major engagement, the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky, on October 8, 1862. Perryville was a ferocious, day-long struggle in which Cleburne, still not fully healed, led his brigade in a series of assaults over the rolling farmland. He was wounded twice more in that battle, one shot bruising him and another slightly wounding his arm, but he refused to leave the field. Cleburne's determination helped the Confederates win a tactical victory at Perryville, though Bragg ultimately withdrew from Kentucky afterward. By the year's end, Patrick Cleburne had become one of the Army's standout young generals, and on December 13, 1862, he received promotion to Major General, taking command of a full division of infantry. This made Cleburne, at the age of 34, the highest-ranking Irish-born officer in American military history. His meteoric rise would continue as the war raged on, and his men's loyalty to Old Pat, as they affectionately called him, grew with every battle. As 1863 dawned, Major General Cleburne was entrusted with leading a division, thousands of soldiers in some of the war's hardest fighting. His leadership style was a mix of tactical aggression and personal bravery. He drilled his troops hard, but also saw to their needs, earning him a reputation as a soldier's general. In battle, Cleburne had a gift for defensive warfare and counterattacks that could blunt superior enemy forces. These qualities soon earned him the nickname the Stonewall of the West, comparing him to Stonewall Jackson, the famed Confederate general in the East. Cleburne's performance in two critical battles, Chickamauga and the Chattanooga campaign, cemented his legacy. In September 1863, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, now under General Braxton Bragg, faced off against Union Major General William Rosecrans' army in Northern Virginia. The result was the Battle of Chickamauga, fought on September 19th and 20th, the bloodiest battle of the Western Theater. On the second day, Cleburne's division was positioned on the Confederate right wing under intense pressure from Union forces led by the rock-solid General George Thomas. Cleburne and another division under John C. Breckinridge launched repeated attacks on Thomas's lines in terrain thick with woods and ravines. The fighting was desperate and often hand-to-hand. Thanks to Cleburne's hammering attacks, Thomas had to call for reinforcements multiple times in order to hold his position. By the end of the day, the Union line partially collapsed elsewhere on the field due to a gap exploited by a Confederate charge, leading to a Southern victory. Cleburne's men, however, had played a vital part in pinning down the Union left. One Confederate observer praised Cleburne's incredible skill and valor shown at Chickamauga. The victory, though, was incomplete. Thomas's staunch defense earned him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga, and the Union Army was able to escape. but it was still a much-needed victory for the Confederacy in the West. Cleburne had further burnished his star as an aggressive, reliable division commander. Chickamauga was followed by the siege of Chattanooga, which culminated in the Battle of Chattanooga in late November 1863. This time, the roles were reversed. Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant shattered Bragg's Confederate Army, driving it from its fortifications on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. Amid the rout, however, Cleburne's division stood out as an island of resistance. Posted on the Confederate right flank, Cleburne repelled repeated Union assaults on Missionary Ridge, holding his ground even as units to his left were overrun. According to reports, Cleburne not only held his position but even counterattacked, buying precious time for the Confederate Army to avoid complete annihilation. You can imagine him at Missionary Ridge, his sword drawn, rallying his men in last-ditched stands as other parts of the line crumbled around them. General Bragg took notice. He singled out Cleburne's incredible skill and valor and praised the critical role that Patrick Cleburne's character played in stiffening his soldiers' spines. Now, after the defeat at Chattanooga, Bragg's army retreated south back into Georgia. Grant ordered Union troops under General Joe Hooker to pursue. The Confederates needed to buy time for an orderly withdrawal, and Cleburne was just the man for the job. On November 27, 1863, at Ringgold Gap, Georgia, Patrick Cleburne turned to make a stand. He arranged his 4,000 men in the wooded mountain pass and daringly ambushed Hooker's advance guard. For 5 hours, Cleburne's men held off an attacking Union force nearly 4 times their number at around 15,000 men in a textbook defensive action. They inflicted heavy casualties on the Federals while scarcely budging from their gap. Cleburne's delaying action saved the Confederate Army's supply trains and artillery, allowing Bragg's forces to escape to safety. It was a brilliant rearguard victory that even Northern accounts acknowledged as such. The Confederate Congress in Richmond officially thanked Cleburne for his triumph at Ringgold Gap, and newspapers hailed him as the savior of the Army. Cleburne himself, modest as ever, attributed the success to his soldiers' courage, but there was no mistaking it. His star had never shone brighter. On that day, he had truly earned his moniker, Stonewall of the West. By early 1864, Patrick Cleburne had proved himself as one of the Confederacy's finest generals. But he was about to make the most controversial decision of his life, one that revealed his pragmatic streak and moral convictions, but threatened his career. The South's situation was growing dire. After 3 years of war, manpower was drying up, and the Union's numerical advantage was only growing. Cleburne, ever the realist, saw the writing on the wall. In his view, the Confederacy needed to take drastic action to address its most vulnerable point, the very institution of slavery that had sparked secession in the first place. While Cleburne had fought to defend the South, he understood that slavery was, quote, an embarrassment and an insidious weakness for the Confederacy. In a bold move, he decided to propose arming enslaved African Americans and offering them freedom in return for military service. On January 2, 1864, at the Army's winter quarters in Dalton, Georgia, General Cleburne convened a meeting of the Army of Tennessee's High Command. With the endorsement of several junior officers, he laid out his argument in a detailed written, what was called memorial. The gist of Cleburne's proposal was revolutionary. Recruit thousands of enslaved men, train them as soldiers, and free them and their families as a reward for their loyalty. He reasoned that this policy would solve 2 problems at the same time. It would both bolster the crumbling Southern armies and eliminate the very issue, slavery, that had prevented foreign nations like Britain from recognizing or aiding the Confederacy. In one passage of his writing, Cleburne wrote that slavery was the Confederacy's Achilles heel, calling it a, quote, continued embarrassment, and predicting that without enlisting black soldiers, the South had very little hope of victory As I look at this and I think about the context in which Cleburne is laying these things out, I see the benefit to a man who is educated and capable but didn't grow up in the South. He had come here as an immigrant, and so he didn't have the background that many of the people that we refer to as the Southern gentlemen planters, who were many of the Confederacy's high command, who had grown up in that system and knew nothing else. Cleburne had a very unique worldview through which to see things, and he saw things in a rational way that many of his fellow Confederate generals were not able to see. Now, as you might expect, the reaction in the room when he presented his plan was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. To most Confederate leaders, the idea of arming enslaved people struck at the core of what they believed the war was about. One general said Cleburne's proposal would shake our government to its foundations, and another declared that it was at war with his social, moral, and political principles. The Army of Tennessee's commander, General Joe Johnston, worried that even discussing Cleburne's memo verged on treason. In fact, one outraged officer, General W.H.T. Walker, went over Cleburne's head and reported the proposal directly to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Davis was furious. He ordered that Cleburne's idea be suppressed entirely, fearing that it would sow discord and desperation. The memo was tucked away. Officers were forbidden from even mentioning it again. Cleburne had expected pushback, but the vehemence stung anyway. He had spoken what many thought unspeakable. In hindsight, Cleburne's plan was indeed far ahead of its time, or at least ahead of his government's will to act. Over a year later, in March 1865, with the Confederacy on its last legs, Richmond finally authorized the enlistment of enslaved men with promised emancipation as a last-ditch measure. But by then, it was far too late. Only a few dozen black recruits were trained, and none of them saw combat before the war ended. One can only speculate how things might have been different had Cleburne's proposal been adopted sooner. What is clear is that the episode likely cost Cleburne any chance of further promotion. Despite his brilliance on the battlefield, some in Richmond began to view him with suspicion after these events. The Irish general had pricked the bubble of the Confederate ideology, and in doing so, perhaps sealed his own political fate. Still, within the Army of Tennessee ranks, Cleburne remained widely respected. Even those who disagreed with him knew Patrick Cleburne's devotion to the cause was unquestioned. As he famously said around this time, quote, "If this Confederacy that is so dear to my heart is doomed to fail, I pray heaven may let me fall with it, while my face is toward the enemy and my arm battling for that which I know to be right." End quote. Those words would prove prophetic before the year was over. After the turmoil of his ill-fated proposal, Cleburne returned to doing what he did best, leading men in battle. In May 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman launched his massive offensive into Georgia, aiming to capture Atlanta. Opposing him was the Confederate Army of Tennessee, initially under General Joe Johnston and later by General John Bell Hood. As Sherman's blue-coated legions advanced step by step, Cleburne's division was in the thick of nearly every major engagement of the Atlanta campaign. All through the summer of 1864, from rocky ridges to dense forests, Cleburne's men earned a reputation as the Army's fire brigade, always sent to the hottest part of the fight. At the Battle of Resaca in May, Cleburne counterattacked a Union breakthrough, stabilizing the line. A few days later at Pickett's Mill, he achieved one of his finest tactical victories. There, Sherman unwisely hurled Union troops into a dusk assault on Cleburne's well-entrenched division. The result was a bloody repulse. Cleburne's soldiers inflicted around 1,600 Union casualties while sustaining only about 500 themselves. A lopsided victory that one historian called a rather one-sided slaughter. It was said that Sherman omitted mention of Pickett's Mill in official reports out of embarrassment, but Cleburne's troops took pride in having delivered the Federal Army a stinging defeat, albeit on a smaller stage. By July, President Davis had replaced the cautious Johnston with aggressive John Bell Hood. Cleburne was dismayed at the change. He believed removing Johnston was a disaster for the Confederacy. Under Hood's more reckless leadership, the Atlanta campaign turned even more desperate. Cleburne fought courageously in Hood's big battles around Atlanta that summer, including the battles of Peachtree Creek and Ezra Church, where he skillfully led his division in furious fighting. But each time, despite tactical flashes of brilliance, the Confederate assaults failed to stop Sherman's advance. By early September, Atlanta fell to the Union forces. It was a crushing strategic blow. During a brief lull after the fall of Atlanta, Cleburne experienced a rare moment of personal happiness amid the gloom of war. While he was in Georgia, he had met and fallen in love with Susan Tarleton, a young woman from Mobile, Alabama. In the summer of 1864, they became engaged, and Cleburne hoped to marry Susan that winter. He'd even joked with friends about a wedding, perhaps dreaming of a peacetime future as a husband. Sadly, history had other plans. Before Cleburne and Susan could meet at the altar, General Hood embarked on one last gamble that would put Patrick Cleburne in mortal peril, the Franklin-Nashville campaign. Hood's plan in late 1864 was audacious, some would argue reckless. Rather than continue confronting Sherman, who was now marching to the sea, Hood took the Army of Tennessee and moved north into Tennessee, hoping to draw Sherman back or at least wreak havoc behind Union lines. By late November, Hood's forces were chasing Union Major General John Schofield's troops toward Nashville. On November 29th, a fiasco at Spring Hill allowed Schofield's Federals to slip past Hood's trap. A furious Hood fixed his sights on the small town of Franklin, Tennessee, where Schofield's men dug in on the south side of town. Against the advice of his top generals, Cleburne and the cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest included, Hood decided to launch a direct frontal assault on the Union fortifications at Franklin before dusk on November 30th. It was a decision that would lead to one of the Civil War's most lopsided bloodbaths. Patrick Cleburne understood all too well the odds they were facing. Climbing Winstead Hill that afternoon, he gazed through field glasses at the Union line and muttered, "They are formidable." Earthworks bristling with artillery stretched across the Franklin Plain, some works 8 feet high and fronted by entanglements of sharpened branches and locust thickets. It was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. Summoned to Hood's council, Cleburne joined his fellow officers in strongly advising against an open field charge. Hood brushed them aside. He believed Franklin was the key to Nashville and ordered them forward, telling Cleburne to attack without firing until they had crossed the first Union line of works. Cleburne, loyal to the last, bowed to his orders. That's when he uttered his determined pledge, "General, I will take the works or fall in the attempt." As we saw in our opening, Cleburne's final moments before battle were poignant. He gave instructions to attack at the point of the bayonet and ride over the enemy trenches at all costs. Knowing the grim odds, he exchanged those fateful words with General Govan about dying like men. Around 4 p.m., 20 Confederate brigades, nearly 20,000 men, surged forward in a grand charge over 2 miles of open ground. Cleburne led one of the lead divisions, commanding regiments of Texans, Tennesseans, Alabamians, and Mississippians, and even a regiment of Irish immigrants like himself. They advanced in perfect battle order, banners flying, a sight later remembered as majestic and terrifying. Union soldiers holding the main line by the Carter House could hardly believe the audacity of it. Then, all hell broke loose. Cleburne rode into the fray on a borrowed horse. Union cannon and rifles opened up, tearing gaps in the gray ranks. Still, Cleburne and his men pressed on as he waved a cap and shouted encouragement to keep them moving through the storm of lead. Suddenly, the mare was shot out from under him, collapsing about 80 yards from the Union works. A staff courier leapt from his horse and offered it to Cleburne. As the general tried to mount, that horse was killed too, shot before he could swing into the saddle. Undeterred, Cleburne drew his sword, abandoned any thought of riding, and charged ahead on foot into the smoke and chaos. It was early twilight now, and the battle raged with terrifying intensity all along the line. Men fell in heaps. The ground became littered with the wounded and the dead. Cleburne reached a point perhaps 50 yards from the enemy's main earthworks, near a landmark cotton gin on the field. By then, much of his division had been slaughtered or pinned down. As he rallied a cluster of his remaining soldiers for a final push, a single Union infantryman took aim and fired. A minie-ball struck General Cleburne just below the heart, passing through his body. Patrick Cleburne fell, mortally wounded, amid the blood-soaked ground he had so gallantly tried to take. The men around him were likely too pressed to notice in that moment. The fighting raged on ferociously even after dark. It wasn't until the next morning, December 1st, that searchers roaming the ghastly field found Patrick Cleburne's lifeless form. He was discovered lying flat on his back about 50 yards from the Union works, his face calm as if asleep. In a sad detail recorded by witnesses, his boots, sword, watch, and any valuables had been stolen, plundered by scavengers in the night. The 36-year-old general was dressed in a new Confederate gray uniform, now stained with blood on the left side. Soldiers gently placed his body in an ambulance wagon alongside several other fallen officers, including some of his friends, like Brigadier General Hiram Granbury, who also died leading his Texans that day. Cleburne's body was taken to a nearby plantation house, where grieving comrades laid him on the porch next to 5 other generals killed in the assault. One of his fellow division commanders, General Frank Cheatham, would later return to Franklin and stand at that very spot where Cleburne fell. He remarked, quote, "Here one of the best soldiers that ever drew sword gave up his life," end quote. The Battle of Franklin was over, a Confederate disaster resulting in some 6,000 Southern casualties in just a few hours, including those 6 generals killed or mortally wounded. Among those lost, though, none was more revered than Patrick Cleburne. News of Cleburne's death sent shockwaves through the Confederate Army and beyond. Soldiers who had served under him were devastated. In them, Cleburne had inspired fierce loyalty. They admired not only his battlefield prowess, but his integrity and uncommon foresight. In one poignant eulogy, a Confederate officer likened Cleburne to a meteor, brilliant and short-lived, who shone brightly and then was gone too soon. Even opponents paid their respects. Union accounts acknowledged Cleburne as a formidable foe. Some Northern soldiers at Franklin, upon learning whom they had killed, expressed regret at the loss of such a gallant leader. Cleburne's remains were eventually taken from Franklin and laid to rest in Columbia, Tennessee. A few years later, in 1870, friends saw to it that he was reinterred in his adopted hometown of Helena, Arkansas. Today, a simple but imposing monument marks his grave in Helena's Confederate cemetery, engraved with his name and the incorrect birth date of St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 1828. The Patrick Cleburne Memorial Obelisk stands over his final resting place in Arkansas. The inscription speaks to the esteem in which he was held. In Arkansas, they named an entire county after him, Cleburne County, commemorating their adopted son who rose to greatness. The city of Cleburne, Texas, likewise, bears his name, and a bronze statue of the general, binoculars in hand, now stands there to honor his memory. History buffs continue to study and debate Cleburne's campaigns for their tactical brilliance. Military historians often rank him among the very best division commanders of the Civil War, frequently wondering if higher command might have fallen to him had he lived longer or politics not intervened. And you can count yours truly among those historians who truly believe that Cleburne was one of the best generals, not just division commanders, but generals in the Confederate Army. And I think the politics did intervene to keep him from higher command, where he no doubt would have performed just as admirably. Cleburne's men fondly called him Stonewall of the West, and indeed, like Stonewall Jackson, Cleburne was fearless, intense, and adept at making the most of limited resources. Unlike many of his Confederate peers, Cleburne was an outsider, an Irish immigrant with no family plantation or West Point pedigree. And maybe that gave him a different perspective, as I mentioned earlier. After all, he was the general who dared to question Confederate policies and advocate for emancipation in exchange for service. That audacious proposal, though rejected, marks Cleburne as a particularly forward-thinking figure among Confederate high command. It showed that he understood the larger moral and pragmatic stakes of the war in a way that few of his fellow officers did. But Patrick Cleburne was also a man of his time. He tied his fate to the Confederacy's cause, believing he was defending his adopted home's rights, even as he personally disavowed slavery. His complexity is part of what makes him so intriguing. In him, idealism and realism converged on the battlefield. He exemplified personal bravery, literally leading from the front to his dying breath. And he also exemplified strategic insight, as seen in his writings left behind. It's tempting to imagine the contributions he might have made during Reconstruction or as a voice of reconciliation if he had survived the war. But like so many promising figures of the Civil War, his story ended all too soon, amid guns and smoke and fury, before victory or defeat was fully decided. After Cleburne's death, the Confederate Army of Tennessee limped on to a final defeat at Nashville 2 weeks after Franklin, and the war itself ended a few months after that. But Cleburne's legacy did not die on that Franklin field. In the decades since, he has been remembered in memoirs and histories as a symbol of what was best in the Confederate military effort in the West: tactical brilliance, tenacity, and a willingness to confront hard truths. Modern historians continue to explore his life in biographies with titles like Stonewall of the West, and Civil War enthusiasts visit sites associated with him, from Ringgold Gap to Franklin, to pay homage to his accomplishments. Today, if you walk the battlefield at Franklin or stand by Cleburne's statue in Helena, you might reflect on the journey of an Irish teenager who became an American legend. You might hear echoes of his brogue shouting, "Forward, men," as he charged on foot into the jaws of death. And you might ponder the irony that a man who gave his all for the Confederacy also foresaw the need to change it from within. Patrick Cleburne's story is not just a Civil War story. It's an immigrant's tale, a story of loyalty, of courage, and of bold thinking in times of crisis. In the end, as Cleburne himself had wished, he fell with the cause he loved, his face to the enemy. And in doing so, he secured a place in the annals of history that continues to fascinate and inspire those of us who seek to understand the complexities of a tumultuous time in American history. This has been Stories of the Civil War. I'm Chris Mowry. Thanks for listening.